Good afternoon. Welcome to Kettering Conversations with Democracy Innovators. I'm Brad Rourke. I'm Director of External Affairs and DC Operations for the Kettering Foundation. Many of you here know us, but for those on Zoom who don't maybe, Kettering Foundation is a nonpartisan, nonprofit operating foundation founded in 1927 by the inventor Charles F. Kettering. Our focus is solely on advancing inclusive democracy. This is one in a series of public conversations that Kettering convenes regularly, both in Dayton, where we're headquartered, and here in Washington, DC, where we have offices near Capitol Hill on the Senate side. A lot of work went into putting this program together. There's a large committee behind this. I'd like to recognize just a few who've been doing particularly heavy lifting. That's Derek Barker, who chairs the committee, Melinda Gilmore, Darla Minnick, Sarah Murphy, Caroline Parati, and Kate Schneider. Would you join me in thanking them, please? This convening takes place against a particular background. The U.S. Supreme Court is set to rule this month, any day now, on Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard and v. University of North Carolina, which is likely to dismantle race-conscious admissions practices at colleges and universities, but is also likely to have broader effects. Our panelists and moderator will go into greater detail on this as they discuss recent attacks on higher education and their implications for inclusive democracy. So we're going to get right to our session. I'll introduce the panelists and then turn it over. There will be time for questions from the audience, and we'll adjourn by 2:15, at which time there will be time to network and enjoy some hors d'oeuvres. With us today, in alpha order, are Sheryll Cashin, who is Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law, Civil Rights, and Social Justice at Georgetown Law School. Her latest book of many is White Space, Black Hood, about the role of residential segregation in producing racial inequality. She's widely published in both academic and mainstream outlets, watch Politico, and has served in the Clinton White House, clerked for the Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. Melissa Murray is Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law at New York University School of Law and faculty director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. Also widely published, she served as a law clerk to then U.S. Court of Appeals Judge Sonia Sotomayor. She's co-host of the popular Supreme Court podcast Strict Scrutiny, and many of you have seen her frequently as a legal analyst on MSNBC. Eduardo Padron is President Emeritus of Miami-Dade College, having served from 1995 to 2019. Under his leadership, MDC received national recognition for its long-standing involvement with the surrounding community and the marked difference the college made in student success and access. Truly an icon, in 2016, President Barack Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom for being a prominent national voice for access and inclusion in higher education. These three distinguished panelists will be in conversation with President and CEO of the Kettering Foundation, Sharon L. Davies. Her own experience includes law, academia, public affairs, and more. Prior to Kettering, she was provost and senior vice president for academic affairs at Spelman College, chief diversity officer at The Ohio State University, where she was on the law faculty for over 2 decades, occupied the Gregory H. Williams Chair in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and, as if that were not enough, directed the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. Please join me in welcoming this distinguished and consequential panel. And with that, over to you, Davies.
All right, thank you so much, Brad, and many, many thanks to our wonderful panelists. I see a number of familiar faces in the room, too. We're delighted to host this important conversation at an important moment for higher education in our country. I am now the president and CEO of the Kettering Foundation, and as Brad said, our focus is on democracy, strengthening democracy, domestically and around the world, and we know that higher education plays a particularly important role in helping to strengthen and preserve our democracy. So in recent days, we have focused on attacks that are being made on colleges and universities, and we're also mindful of an important decision that is about to be handed down by the United States Supreme Court in a case brought against Harvard University and the University of North Carolina for its race-conscious admissions practices. As I've thought about this moment, it brings me back to the time that I actually was about to start college myself as an undergraduate. And I'm aging myself, but I'm willing to do it because I remember what it felt like as an undergraduate who was arriving on a campus that had only really just recently begun to admit students of color in appreciable numbers. And that was the result of the victories of the civil rights era. But it was also a moment when the Supreme Court had just decided its first case brought against the University of California Medical School, the Bakke case, back in 1978, when the question was it constitutional for that medical school to consider the race of applicants to the medical school when it decided on who to bring into their entering class. That was 1978. Since then, we have seen this issue come back to the United States Supreme Court again and again and again, and it is before the court now. In each one of those cases, just to level set the conversation, the United States Supreme Court has been closely divided, but it has upheld the decisions of universities and colleges to consider race as long as they do it in a particularly sensitive and careful way. And the common justification is that putting together a richly diverse class, including racial diversity, does give educational benefits to all students who attend those schools. Yet the Supreme Court is once again poised to decide this case, and many predictions are that it will break way with its decisions from the past. So I'm thrilled to have this panel of experts who themselves have committed so many years to higher education to help us think about the issues in the case and the implications of it if the case is decided in contrary to 40 plus years of jurisprudence in this area. Melissa, let me start with you and ask you to think about what the possibilities are for this case. I see three. One is that they decide the case consistent with the past. One is that they decide that diversity is a compelling state interest, but the campuses in question did not do it carefully enough. And then finally, the worst case scenario, I suppose, might be that they decide that diversity is not a compelling state interest and can't be pursued in this way or other ways. So John, please give us your expert thoughts about what that all might mean.
Sure, so thank you for having me. Many thanks to the Kettering Foundation for convening us and for doing such a seamless job of getting us all here. Big props to Kate, who got me home from Union Station last night. That was terrific, thank you. Let me first say that this is actually two cases, and they're actually meaningfully different in important ways. So the Harvard case, which has gotten the lion's share of the press, is actually a statutory challenge brought under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits those in receipt of federal funds, which most private universities are, from discriminating on the basis of race. And so the claim here is that Harvard's admissions protocol, which does consider race as part of an holistic admissions complement where many factors are considered, discriminates against certain students, namely Asian American students who, it is argued, are disadvantaged in the Harvard admissions process. The second case, the UNC case, is actually a constitutional case, and the argument there is that UNC's race-conscious admissions policy, which is also an holistic admissions policy, discriminates on the basis of race, and in doing so violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So those are the two cases. You were exactly right, Sharon. I think there are three outcomes here. One is the court preserves the status quo, which was set in 2003 in Grutter and then was later elaborated in the Fisher decisions from 2016. I don't think that's the way this court's going to go to preserve what we had, and that's largely because it's not the same court. We now have a conservative 6-3 super majority. We have Justice Thomas, who is now the longest serving justice on that court. He has been very upfront about his antipathy for race-conscious admissions policy, and he was very active in oral argument and sort of articulating that claim, and he has some allies on the court. Justice Alito seemed persuaded. The Chief Justice has also written very eloquently about his concerns about what he calls the sordid business, this divvying up by race. And he's joined, of course, by three new Trump appointees, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. And the real question there is there any play in the joints with those three? I think we know exactly where some of the others are. So I don't think we're going to get that status quo preservation decision. I think the two most realistic possibilities is, one, a decision that essentially says that the two schools did not do race-conscious admissions properly. Like, yes, you may consider race, but in these two particular cases, the use of race was not sensitive enough, was not holistic enough to comply with what the court has said in its earlier cases. Not sure that's going to be the outcome either. And then the third possibility is that the court completely does a 180 and disavows its earlier jurisprudence, and it begins the process of dismantling the use of race-conscious admissions policy. I will say a couple of things about that. Usually to get into the Supreme Court and to have a case heard at any level of the federal judiciary, you need what's known as standing, which is to say you have been injured and your injury has been caused by the defendant. It's not clear that the injury of which the litigants claim or complain is the use of race, because again, race is one of many different factors in these admissions protocols that these schools are using. So it's hard, I think, for any of the litigants to make a compelling claim that they know they were denied by Harvard or they know they were denied by the University of North Carolina and the reason was race, because the admissions calculus is so multivarious at this point. There's so many different factors involved, and that question of standing came up briefly in oral arguments and was immediately sort of shut down by the 6 members of the court's supermajority. So we don't care about standing anymore. And as we learned last year in the Dobbs case, we may not care about precedents either. And so that really does clear the way, I think, for this court to begin the process of refashioning what it means to live in a multiracial, inclusive democracy where opportunities are often mediated by educational outcomes. And I think that's what's on the table. And there may be some carve-outs here. I think we saw at oral argument that there was some interest in thinking about the way the military academies play a particularly unique role in our society, and there may be carve-outs for the use of race in the context of the military academies and military service. But from what I could see at oral arguments, this was a court where all 9 members seemed to be functioning under the view that affirmative action was over, and the real question was, what are we going to do and what will be permissible going forward?
Wow. Well, if that's the case, and I want to invite you, Sheryll, into this conversation as well. And you've written some pieces about what might be driving, what's the underlying concern here that has brought this issue back before the court so many times. You've talked about the demographic shifts in the country and anxieties that are related to that. So help us understand both the implications of this if the court actually decides the case in the way that Melissa is suggesting.
Well, as everybody in this room knows, and hello, and thank you for having me, Kettering Foundation. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy you all decided to spend your day with us, or a couple hours with us. So we all know that we are, I think, about 5 decades in of a politics on the right of stoking resentment about affirmative action and other things in a way that's it's a continuum of politics that sort of is designed to convince whites that the civil rights revolution was such that gains of Black Americans and others have come at their expense. And it's just the easiest, cheapest politics. It's just gotten kind of more toxic and more angry over time. So, you know, from Richard Nixon forward, law and order, anti-affirmative action, anti-CRT now, anti-DEI, anti-woke, anti-trans, anti-drag, anti-choice. It's all in the same vein, and if we're honest, it's part of a white Christian identity politics that is central to GOP base politics. And meanwhile, at the same time we've had that 5 decades of stoking of racial resentment, we also have had a spike in economic inequality in this country, right? And it is structural. This is a lot what I write what I write about, right? There are a lot of struggling people, and particularly since the Great Recession, there are a lot of white people who have experienced the loss of middle class status. Actually, concentrated poverty grew fastest in the suburbs in the 2010s, right? And so there are a lot of people who are feeling economically left out. They see elites of all colors and feel that elites, or they're told constantly in increasingly siloed communication, you know, everybody gets their news from different sources, but there's a lot of disinformation, but there are a lot of people, politicians and media personalities who tell economically marginal people that people on the other side are against you, they're out for you, they're for other people, right? So that's the politics, right? So it's actually quite easy to find political right against affirmative action, but it's really easy in this environment to find litigants who are willing to challenge anything that can be at least theoretically a claim that this policy that's designed to include is really designed to exclude me and harms me, right? So, and there's also social science that shows there is a widespread perception gap between whites and people of color, on average. I'm not talking about everybody, but on average, but particularly among white Republicans, where they perceive that there's more racial discrimination against them than underrepresented or historically discriminated against racial minorities. That is what's going on, and that is what makes this anti-affirmative action, or all this stoking easy. So that's the context, right? And meanwhile, when you add structural constraints, this is implications for democracy. The Electoral College, the disproportionate representation in the Senate, extreme gerrymandering, and a politically constructed conservative minority on the court, what we have, the implications for democracy, is a country in which we largely have minority rule. And, so that's where we are.
There was a moment, and I want to bring Eduardo in, but before I do, it strikes me that it's significant that Harvard is one of the defendants here, when Harvard has from the very beginning been considered the gold standard when it comes to being able to construct a constitutionally defensible race-conscious admissions practice, right? That's what Justice Powell said in the Bakke case back in 1978, and it's been pointed to ever since. So if Harvard's program doesn't pass muster, then what would be a program that would satisfy the court if the decision comes out that way?
So this is a great question, and I'll be brief so we can get Eduardo in here as well. Justice Powell in the Bakke decision is a famously fractured decision, no majority for the court, but Justice Powell's opinion, his separate opinion, is the one that has sort of carried the day, where he talked about the Harvard plan, where the school would admit what he called the schoolboy from Iowa. Like, that was the kind of diversity that could be permissible, and it sort of set us on this path for thinking about affirmative action no longer in remedial or reparative terms, but specifically in terms of diversity, and this idea that we were putting together a classroom in which students of many different types might learn from each other. It is purposeful that Harvard is on the hot seat here. Not only is it the originator of that idea of academic diversity, it's a private school, right? So this is not simply going to be contained in schools like the University of Texas or California or Florida or those public schools. This is going to affect every private institution, and all of those private institutions are trying to be like Harvard. So if Harvard's wrong, they're all wrong, and now we're going to try and figure out what's right, and if Harvard pulls back, they're all going to pull back.
So Eduardo, I want to bring you in because it's pretty clear. You pick up a newspaper, you watch the news at night, that higher education is in the news, and diversity on college campuses is in the news beyond this particular Supreme Court case. And so you come from the state of Florida. Much of the headlines in the country are coming from that state. Talk to us a little bit about how colleges and universities in the state of Florida and elsewhere as well are having to deal with attacks on diversity in other realms.
Well, thank you. Before doing that, I want to thank you for giving me a microphone with an accent. It's very much appreciated. And before I address that specific question, I'd like to frankly tell you that I'm extremely concerned and actually outraged, because we could cite different things that are happening, but overall, the fact of the matter is that our democracy is in big danger. And it's being attacked like never before. And it's ironic that these attacks are not from a foreign nation. Our American democracy is being attacked from our own people. And for me, this is very personal, because the same autocratic, fascist-leaning measures, laws, executive actions, for example, that are taken in Florida, where I live, are the same reasons why I escaped from my country, my native country, in the 60s as a refugee, because basically the same laws, the same situation as we're experiencing today in Florida. And it's almost, in my wildest dreams, it was difficult to imagine that I would live to see many of the same things that were part of that system happening in my new country. And part of it that is very puzzling to me is that all these, when you look at Florida and what's been happening in the last couple of years, and all this legislation that is taking place, it's all done in the name of freedom. It's all done in the name of free speech and the First Amendment. and which confuses a lot of people. How can you be against freedom? How can you be against the First Amendment? So it is very bothersome because I live it every day. There's not a single day that we don't have one outrageous thing coming out of Tallahassee that is impacting a lot of people. Now, you ask about how do colleges and universities in Florida are dealing with this. All I can tell you is that whether you are in a public school, K through 12, or a college or university campus, especially the faculty, are living under tremendous intimidation and fear and anxiety. Because not only these laws really prevent them from doing many of the things that they believe is the right thing to do in teaching the students, but they are subject to potential significant penalties if they don't abide by the law. If they say the wrong word one day in a classroom, any student can secretly tape that professor and present them with a lawsuit. And not only that law has passed this year, but it's encouraged to the students to be able to do that. The whole thing is so hypocritical, and it's really autocracy at its best. No question, Florida is the epicenter of all of this, but these laws and these executive actions are spreading like fire to many other states. And some of them are still waiting to see, with the many lawsuits that have been set in place, what's going to happen. But it's happening in many other states. And it creates a situation that is almost unbearable. Many of the college campuses, many of the universities have been taken over by this whole philosophy. All the processes that we used to have in terms of selecting presidents, tenure, and all of that has been dismantled in many ways, because now all the job descriptions have been changed. So all the requirements like credentials, experience, and all that have been put away. And when you looked at our flagship universities and many other universities in Florida, the public ones, most of the presidents that have been installed are politicians that are friends of the main power in Florida. And that creates a very, very difficult situation. The faculty are intimidated. Many of them are beginning to look at other opportunities. You find that real worthy people are not applying for these jobs, not only as faculty, but as presidents. And it creates an unbearable situation. It's very important that we be very clear that all these laws are aimed at imposing a white supremacy ideology. When you think and analyze all these laws, that's what they're trying to do. And a lot of people are concerned, but unfortunately, like with many things, some people feel, well, right now I'm not affected, so I'm doing my own thing. And again, I came from a country where that's how people began to feel, and eventually everybody was touched. And everyone was affected by these laws. And I think when you stay quiet, you become complicit. And I think hopefully people are beginning to realize that that's the case. I can tell you that I feel really bad for my former faculty and my colleagues, because it's almost impossible to do their jobs. In Florida, the 28 presidents of the community colleges, even though they are now called state colleges, they are community colleges in essence, signed a letter praising those policies. And that letter not only said that, but they pledged to eliminate all DEI, all the diversity, inclusion, and equity programs, and as well as critical theory, race theory. And I've talked to a couple of them, and I said, why? How can you justify doing that? And I felt bad for them, even though I would have done differently. And it's very difficult, it's very easy to say that when you are not in their shoes. But the fact of the matter is that what they explained to me is the coercion and the threats in terms of the funding for the school, in terms of their own jobs and all that, was something that they just couldn't explain to the full extent of the word. And that's, I think, very, very sad when something like that happens in a state that has an incredibly positive system which have provided a lot of access and a lot of opportunities for people. The laws that have been passed this year and last year touch all aspects of life, but education is the main target. Most of the laws affect education at all levels. And again, the overall purpose and expectation is that they will restrict teaching about the topics that deal with the most enduring challenges that we have in our nation, such as race, sex, American history. And that it is something that is very perturbing to the faculty and to the staff at these places. Imagine being a member of the faculty at a college and having to register your political views with the state. I know that happens in Russia. I know that happens in Cuba. But to think that in the United States of America, a government forces you to register your political views with the state, imagine the implications of that. Imagine the implications of that. So no wonder the faculty and actually all the staff at these colleges are living in fear and afraid for what these things could be used for. As I said before, the fact that they encourage students to take action against faculty by allowing them to secretly tape a lecture and use it against the faculty member. So I could go on and on because it's an endless list of laws and legislation that were passed just about a month ago, they ended, that really have significant implications for education in Florida. And as I said before, this is spreading out, and that's where the real danger is.
No, and I appreciate it because the headquarters for the Kettering Foundation is in Dayton, Ohio. We are one of the states that has seen a bill that has been submitted and is under consideration right now, as is true, and I think now 23 other states across the country. So it's certainly not isolated to the state of Florida. And one wonders about the chilling effect that would have even beyond the states that have seen that kind of legislative activity. You were the president of Miami-Dade. Give us a perspective of a sitting president today in one of those campuses. You note, Eduardo, that silence is sometimes complicity, but what might cause a president to be reluctant to, in that kind of climate, to actively oppose and voice their concerns about what's happening in Florida?
Well, for some of the presidents, they don't have a problem with anything because they were appointed directly by the power in Tallahassee to the president's position at the college. And we all know that. The search process has been a sham in many ways, and so, but for the ones that really come from the profession and have worked hard to get to those positions, it is extremely, extremely difficult. Because they are under order to eliminate all the DEIs and CRT. You have people that have been working at those institutions, responsible for those topics. You have all kind of activities happening at the colleges. Miami-Dade College, for example, is the most diverse college in the country. It graduates more minorities than any other institution in the country. And DEI and CRT are part of the nature of that institution. And dismantling that, it is something that is painful, and it's something that not many people are willing to be part of that. So, but my main concern is the faculty, because many of us, they are the ones on the front lines. They are the ones who have to face the students. And they're the ones who have that professional obligation to really provide the best of themselves to those students. And to know that you have to ignore certain aspects of history and you cannot bring them into a classroom, or you cannot address certain other issues having to do with gender and so forth and so on. The list is big. It's a very difficult thing. So what do you do? And that's going to have a significant impact on education in the state of Florida.
So let's imagine, Melissa, that the decision goes against Harvard and UNC. Are there ways, without looking directly at race or ethnicity, of putting together a richly diverse class? That seems to be the argument, right, of the plaintiffs in the case. So what can we expect about the results, the immediate results of a decision like that, and would colleges and universities be able to rally and create diversity in other ways?
So I will say it is incredibly likely, in fact, I'd say it's a near certainty, that schools around the country are already preparing for this, already thinking about what they will do when this decision is levied. I think oral argument was pretty straightforward. I think if there is going to be room for hope, it's from that voting rights decision last week, where we had a very surprising decision from the court. But I don't know that we're going to get a surprise. I mean, I do think we're going to get exactly what we're expecting, and I think colleges and universities are preparing for that. So what might serve as criteria that would be constitutionally or statutorily permissible and that do not explicitly consider race? Like, certainly many schools are thinking about socioeconomic status. Again, that could add an important measure of diversity, class diversity, to various schools. It does not necessarily always translate that socioeconomic status is correlated positively with race. Sometimes it is, often it is not in particular circumstances, but that's one thing I think that they are thinking about. I think they're thinking about, again, whether or not asking a student to present herself in a holistic fashion means that you cannot ever think about race, or that student cannot ever talk about race. And I think this was sort of conveyed most forcefully by the court's newest justice, Justice Jackson, in a colloquy with Students for Fair Admissions counsel Patrick Strawbridge, where she presented two hypotheticals, which were absolutely devastating to the plaintiffs. And the hypotheticals are basically about two North Carolinians. One who was a legacy admit, whose family had been students at the New University of North Carolina for 5 generations, and another who's an African American prospective applicant whose parents and family members had been prevented from going to UNC because of the history of enslavement and de jure segregation. And Justice Jackson asked, like, could the first student, the legacy candidate, talk about her family's experience in North Carolina? Of course she could, Patrick Strawbridge claimed. What about the second student? Could that student talk about her family's history of exclusion and how attending the University of North Carolina was important for her because of her family's legacy in the state? No, that could not happen because that is too closely correlated with race. You know, again, a really shocking colloquy, and one that reveals, I think, the poverty of the litigants' claims about affirmative action and the likely First Amendment challenges that could arise. Other challenges or other prospects that were ventilated, including one about whether you could consider a history of enslavement as a means of having students show a kind of diversity that would be constitutionally permissible. And again, this was asked by Justice Kavanaugh. Could you talk about the history of enslavement and the fact that you were descended from slaves? And Patrick Strawbridge, again, for Students for Fair Admission, said that no, you could not, because slavery was too closely correlated with race. Yes, correct, correct it is. But why is that? I mean, so again, I cannot help but think that this is a case that was litigated for the purpose of shutting down a lot of different avenues. And I think it's going to require a lot of creativity, a lot of tenacity, and a lot of resilience to combat this. I think there are very obvious First Amendment concerns that could be ventilated. I think there are lots of different ways that schools might think about this: socioeconomic status, residential plans like Texas's top 10% plan, which is nominally race neutral but depends on the fact of residential segregation in the state of Texas for its efficacy. All of those things are on the table, and what it really comes down to is this court's decision is not going to settle this question. It's just going to spawn new challenges about what is or isn't permissible in the arena of college admissions, and it's also going to spawn questions about what happens in the other aspects of higher education where race has and continues to be salient. So, you know, I have been a dean of a law school. We think about race not just when we are admitting students, but in how we organize classrooms in situations where there are underrepresented students and viewpoints that we do want to surface and ventilate. Can we even do that anymore after this? That's an open question, and it's not one that the Supreme Court is likely to answer. So we are going to see a spate of new cases challenging this. And the whole game here is to shut it down, to chill the consideration of these effects and these kinds of criteria so that we don't talk about race at all.
So Sheryll, you've done some thinking about this, I think, too, and one of the things that Melissa is saying is that maybe there are other ways, like place. Could you talk to us about some of your scholarship on that to give us some hope that there might be other ways of creating diversity?
Absolutely, but I just want to begin by pointing out an irony that's very disturbing to me, which is that the 14th Amendment, which the radical Republicans drafted, was designed to overrule Dred Scott and bring formally bonded Black Americans into full citizenship with new rights that whites were bound to respect. That is not a colorblind project. And it is deeply offensive to me that this amendment, which introduced the concept of racial equality into the US Constitution for the very first time in US history, is being interpreted in a way that is most harmful to the equality aspirations of Black Americans. I just want to say that. It's really offensive. Now, having said that, here are some possibilities. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. First principle is to remind selective institutions. Affirmative action really most matters at selective institutions. That the K-12 pipeline is savagely separate and unequal, and they have no business reifying existing advantage. And I call on them to step back and think about reforming the entire process in a way that scrubs the entire admission process of practices and criteria that actually reify advantage and aren't truly predictive of student success. So that's the first thing, right? So, but my place, okay? It is the case that some of the innovations developed as a result of lawsuits that stopped the use of race or legislation or ballot initiatives that stopped the use of race. A couple of states, particularly Texas, adopted top percentage plans. It's now the top 6 percentage plans. And it's fair. I think all public universities and states should be thinking about this, lobbying for it. It's fair that taxpayers across the state that subsidize these flagship public institutions, that all high-achieving students in a state should be judged against the resources that were available to them. And that's what percentage plans do. They're not a panacea, but it certainly helps. It brings a lot of racial and economic diversity because so many states are segregated. Now, SAT and ACT should be optional. Standardized tests should be optional or not used at all. I prefer optional because that gives maximum agency to the student. But the thing that standardized tests are most predictive of is the wealth of the parents. It predicts almost nothing about long-term performance, and it's actually, there's almost an inverse relationship between how high a test score is and the likelihood that that person's going to give back to society. We say, universities, most of their mission statements say they're trying to develop future leaders who are going to give back. Well, a test score is actually not predictive of that at all. Alternative plus factors. I'm a huge fan of giving a bonus to people who have had to overcome exposure to poverty either in their neighborhood or their school. There's so much research out there. There's so many, it's already there. You can look at Raj Chetty's work. Every zip code in America has been profiled into whether it's high opportunity, medium opportunity, or low opportunity. We need to recognize that overcoming poverty or structural disadvantage, which Latino and Black students are much more likely than white and Asian students to be relegated to a school with quite a few poor kids and much less resources than those kids need, right? Overcoming that is itself a form of merit, right? Okay, scrap legacy preferences. I believe that Ketanji Brown Jackson's, the hypo, within the extent permissible by law, universities should invite students to talk about in their essays what they have had to overcome, and if it's race or systemic racism, or or if they have a legacy of coming out of slavery, and that's a source of pride in terms of what their families have overcome. It's part of their culture. They should be able, within the First Amendment, to discuss that. And I'll stop there with it. But a couple of other things I'll just tick off really, really quickly. Outreach partnerships. Selective universities, by now, most of them have a partnership with a Quest Bridge or a Posse. There are organizations that are out there that are very good at doing research, finding historically underrepresented kids who can do the work at very selective places. Dramatic innovation and outreach. A source told me that for the first time this recruiting season coming up, Harvard University is partnering with Howard University, where they're going on the road together in doing their outreach, right? That's some smart innovation there. I think you should scrap merit aid and return to making financial aid 100% need blind. What does merit aid do? It's a cynical thing where they compete for the most advantaged of needy students, right? I think, and there's some systemic disadvantage there. I think universities should ditch their relationship with US News and World Report. Follow the lead of Columbia and several other, higher education. Just stop participating, stop giving the data, take some pressure off yourself around protecting your precious rankings. Expand the class size. Expand the class size, add more seats if you can do it to create more opportunity for more people. Take in more transfer students. I was looking at the numbers last night. UC Berkeley's entering class from last year had 3.4% black students. Its entering transfer students was 5%, right? You can be more innovative with but go recruit at community colleges. Students at community colleges that have gotten straight A's, some of these really elite places, Amherst is one, have started figuring this out. These are great students who have overcome a lot, done the best with what they have, and they can perform, and they do. All of this, the bottom line message is go forth and break things and innovate, take advantage of there's that saying about, every crisis is an opportunity. So these are some ideas.
Yeah, and you got to think that this past year at least, that university leadership has been thinking about all these different ways, and so the number of schools that have broken with U.S. News and World Report is an indicator of that. Eduardo, before we go to the audience, if in our time left, I did want to ask you, the Kettering Foundation is always thinking about the special role of citizens in a democracy, and what can citizens do at a moment like this when in response to a decision of the United States Supreme Court, for example, that might be harmful to efforts to create diverse college campuses, or do in response to the kinds of legislative activity that you described that are happening in Florida today. What can they do not to be complicit in these forces that are undermining our democracy?
Well, I think that's crucial, and I think we need to take advantage of all the tools that democracy offers us. Number one, the right to vote. Still in this country, I don't think, can take pride on the numbers of people who actually vote in elections. We need to increase that. People need to take that very, very seriously. And we need to be informed. You'll be surprised how many people I have talked to in the last 6 months that have no idea on what's happening in Florida, in spite of all the national attention that is being given, or an understanding of the significance of this legislation that is being passed. I think we all have an obligation to, number one, be informed. Number two, to use the right to vote, to elect the representatives that are going to guarantee that we protect those values that are so dear in a democracy. And number three, I think we need to be more involved. And there are different ways. Involved with your PTA, involved with your college, involved with different organizations, join different groups. What did I do? For example, I joined a group of former college presidents and chancellors to really fight what's going on. And I think that's a group that I think is a national group. And we're trying to do our best to put out our thoughts. Anyone here have the right to write a viewpoint or an editorial, whatever, to the newspapers. I mean, there are so many things that we can do. We cannot become complacent, and we cannot wait for tomorrow. Today, we need to become activated, because the one thing I didn't say, and I think it's very important, maybe I said it, I don't remember, is that these groups that are working to pass these laws are well organized and well funded. And they are very intense in trying to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish. So I think we as citizens who care have to play that citizenship role and make sure that there is something we all can do. And the worst thing that can happen is in Americans, which I have seen it to a great extent, losing the understanding, let me see how I put this, that the power of us, of our collective activities in order to bring about change. And sometimes you hear people say, well, it doesn't matter if I vote or not because this or that. We need to get rid of that. We need to really, those are the best tools we have. There may be others, but I don't know them. Those are the best tools we have to really elect the people that will do justice to this great nation.
Thank you, Eduardo. So I want to open it up to the group that's here in person. If anybody has a question, there are a couple of microphones that can be brought around here in the front. Yes.
Hi, and thank you for doing this. It's been amazing. My name's Tony Bishop. My question is, though, sort of about education itself. With the landscape, and obviously at the highest court in the land, ignoring precedent, how do you think this changes legal education on whole? What are kids being, or students in general being taught in the classroom now about precedent and what have you?
I'm gonna let you answer that.
Yeah, I will say it was a very difficult year to be teaching constitutional law. Last year, when I finished teaching, I told my students that it was very likely that everything we'd learned about the court's abortion jurisprudence would be null and void. I didn't expect it to happen in the middle of the final exam, but the leaked draft opinion came down right as my students were about to take their exam, and I was in this really unusual position of having to send an email to the whole class like, it's just a leaked draft. It is not anything you're responsible for. But of course, that leaked draft became the majority opinion of the court, and it is easy, I think, to give in to the cynicism of it's all politics, it's not law, and certainly I think the students are cynical. Like, they are dealing with so much. Like, this is the generation that has gone through a pandemic. They've seen the Great Recession up close as elementary school students, and now they're living in a world where the court, with just a stroke of a pen, can upend everything. I think the thing that, to me, is most salient here, and that I try to impart to them, is like, none of this is forever. It doesn't have to be forever. We have seen the oscillations of this court before. This court has never been a vehicle for progressive change. It's always been more revanchist than the people itself, and we have to remember that. The Warren Court is a blip. The court has always been more conservative than the populace, and again, how do we push back on that? Where do we fight? We fight in state courts. I mean, what can people do? We need to be in state legislatures, in local counties, the local city councils. All of this is happening at every level of government, and we can be at every level of government, and we can fight there too. It's not just a federal fight. It doesn't just happen in federal court. We can think about that. We need to stop thinking about these issues as siloed. There's education, and there's abortion, and there's voting. This transcends everything. This is about democracy, and those issues undergird the entire landscape of democracy. You don't get laws like the ones Eduardo is talking about unless you have so gerrymandered a state legislature and so prevented the people from making their voices heard in a way that truly is representative. So all of these things are linked to a fundamental assault on democracy, keeping people in the dark, gaslighting people about what the true threats are, and making the prospect of a truly educated citizenry more remote. And we have to fight back at that. And the way to fight back against all of this is at the voting booth. And we have to fight back in bigger numbers than ever before, because the malapportionment in our state legislatures is so profound. So everyone has to do something all the time, and we can leave no power on the table.
Other questions from the group? Yes, we're over here.
Thank you so much for this. This has been fascinating. It's been really wonderful hearing all of your insights. I don't work in this specific area, but one thing that I have noticed is that we hear from experts. We don't really hear, and when we do hear from students, it's individual voices. Is there a place, and I agree we need to vote, and I think courts are also a very important space, but to Sharon's question about what citizens can do, do you have thoughts about whether there are ways to try and have students collectively tell us what they think, whether it's at a university level, private universities, public universities, or I don't know if there's a place for Board of Educations to get involved. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Well, I have seen more and more of this of young people, particularly in the whole book banning, anti-CRT stuff. I keep seeing more and more evidence of young people showing up at the school board meeting, or the young man out in, I can't remember where it was it Washington? I know. He ran for, was it city council? I think he ran for city council. He was so mad about all of this, and he won, So collectively and individually, I think students who are affected, whether it's at K through 12 or it's universities that don't like it, I think they're some of the most powerful, and their generation is coming, right? It's a difficult thing to say, but the so-called silent generation is almost going to be silent very soon. If you just look at, and each generation I think is a little bit better than before, but I would encourage students collectively and they do it a lot in law schools, they protest about everything, right? But I would encourage them collectively to get engaged, particularly with the public processes and democracy itself. And like that 25-year-old from Florida, run for office.
There's another hand up here.
Maureen Hoyler, and I represent the Council for Opportunity in Education, which is an organization that lobbies for and programs that are class-based while supporting programs that are race-based. The right seems so much more serious about achieving what they want to achieve, where institutions such as higher education that are thought of as liberal, those 29 states that have this legislation, they're all come out of one or two organizations. They're not 29 separate people that came up with books to ban or being anti-DEI. What should higher education and what should organizations like Kettering be doing to promote a more aggressive support of democracy?
Well, I guess I can take the Kettering Foundation perspective, and I think that all of us, Melissa really put it well, I think, is to see what is happening in our society today as connected, and that it is an ongoing challenge to our democracy, the idea that the diversity of the country is being attacked in ways and trying to be contained. That's a dangerous thing for a democracy at a time of rapid demographic shift. It reminds me of something that our historian named Vincent Harding once wrote in an essay called "Is America Possible?" And he said to that question, America is possible. The premise of the question is that America isn't yet fully itself. It's not yet fully the democracy that the ideals that are captured in our founding documents wanted for the country. We knew we had to go a long way to get to that moment when we could say that we were fully a democracy. And that arguably didn't happen until the victories of the civil rights era in the 20th century. And since then, what we have been talking about here is a sort of regression that is undermining many of the victories that did happen as a result of all of that citizen action, really, demands for a fuller democracy. So it's not coincidental that the challenges to race-conscious admissions practices started in the 70s, right after those victories, when the doors of universities and other places, workplaces, were being opened wider to more Americans. So these things are connected. And so I think Melissa is absolutely right that all of us as citizens have to think about what it is that we can do. And Eduardo emphasizing the right to vote is an important act that we know that we can do, but it's also an act that is being challenged in our democracy today, and the votes of young people, the most diverse group of Americans today, is especially under attack. So that is how we know that what Melissa is saying is that this is all connected, and it is a part of an effort to keep the United States from becoming the full democracy, one that respects the strength of the nation as the strength of its diversity. So although we've focused on higher education today, we really are talking about our democracy. And if we lose our democracy, which many, more and more Americans feel that is actually possible, then the world has suffered a grievous wound as well, because we know that what happens here is important to democracy around the world. And if that is not hyperbolic, if that is not overwrought, but an actual legitimate concern for us as citizens committed to a democracy, then it really does mean that we have to look for every opportunity to make our wishes known and to hold our elected officials accountable to the public will as well. So I see Brad is touching his watch and telling me that we are going to have to bring this to a close. But I just want to thank our outstanding panelists for this conversation today. Thank you for your willingness all the time, every day, and everything that you do to help the nation navigate its way through these kinds of conversations. The Kettering Foundation has made a commitment to be more public-facing and hosting conversations like this in the days, weeks, months to come. We are in a very important moment as a nation. And we feel a special obligation as a foundation committed to strengthening democracy around the world to make sure that we're doing that important work here in our communities, in our nation. We're so thankful for everyone making the time to be here, and we look forward to many, many more opportunities to engage around issues in democracy in the days to come. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Gareth.